The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of Kandahar airfield like a blade. Major Valentina Ghost Kozlov sat in the briefing room, her weathered flight suit bearing patches from 3 combat tour, watching younger pilots scroll through their phones while waiting for the mission commander. The emergency klaxon hadn't sounded, but something electric hung in the recycled air, the kind of tension that preceded either glory or catastrophe. "Listen up, children." Colonel Martinez entered with the swagger of a man who'd never been denied anything, least of all respect. His eyes swept past Ghost as if she were furniture. "We've got a situation developing in Sector 7. High-value target extraction gone sideways. Ground teams pinned down, 48 hours overdue for exfil." He tapped the projection screen, revealing satellite imagery of jagged mountains bisected by a narrow valley. Taliban's moved heavy armor into the region. SA-24's confirmed. This isn't a playground mission. Ghost studied the terrain while Martinez continued his briefing, her green eyes tracing potential approach vectors that others might miss. She'd flown these mountains when half the room was still in flight school, navigating by instinct and hard-earned knowledge of how air currents behaved among those unforgiving peaks. The youngest pilot, Lieutenant Reeves, caught her attention with a nervous adjustment of his helmet strap. Fresh meat, probably thinking about his girlfriend back in Nebraska. "Four-ship formation," Martinez announced. "Call signs Falcon 1 through 4. I'll lead naturally. Hendricks, you're my wingman. Peterson, you've got 3, and..." His pause carried the weight of reluctant obligation. "Kozlov, your tail end, Charlie. Try to keep up." The dismissal in his voice sparked familiar anger in Ghost's chest, but her expression remained marble-smooth. She'd learned long ago that reactions only fed the machine designed to grind women into doubt. Around the room, subtle glances passed between the male pilots, some sympathetic, others skeptical. The unspoken question hung in the air. What was a washed-up veteran doing on a mission that demanded split-second reflexes and absolute trust? "Intel suggests enemy fighters scrambled from Bagram," Martinez continued, oblivious to the undercurrents. "Unknown numbers, unknown capabilities. Row is weapons-free on confirmed hostiles. Questions?" Ghost's hand remained steady on her kneeboard while others fidgeted. She knew something they didn't, something about those mountains that intelligence briefings couldn't capture. Her grandmother's voice echoed from childhood. "Patience, little wolf. Let them underestimate you until the moment you strike." The old woman had survived the siege of Leningrad by being invisible until invisibility became her weapon. Martinez checked his watch. "Wheels up in 20, don't embarrass the squadron." His eyes found Ghosts for the first time. "Especially you, Kozlov. This isn't the old days when standards were flexible." The briefing room emptied with the efficient chaos of pre-flight preparation. Ghost remained seated, studying the mission parameters one final time. Something felt wrong, not with the mission, but with how eagerly Martinez had accepted it. In her experience, colonels who volunteered for dangerous extractions usually had hidden motivations. Outside, the Afghan dawn painted the flight line in shades of amber and steel. 4 F-16 fighting Falcons sat in formation, their sleek profiles catching the early light like predatory birds. Ground crews swarmed around each aircraft, conducting final checks with the precision of a ballet performed in coveralls and safety gear. The smell of jet fuel mixed with desert dust created an intoxicating cocktail that had defined Ghost's adult life. She walked her pre-flight inspection with methodical care, running her hands along control surfaces that had carried her through 3 combat tours. The aircraft responded to her touch like a familiar lover, every rivet and panel exactly where it should be. Her crew chief, Sergeant Chen, watched with the protective intensity of a man who'd seen too many pilots not come home. "She's purring like a kitten, Major," Chen reported, his Brooklyn accent cutting through the morning noise. "Fuel's topped off, weapons are hot, and I replaced that hydraulic line you mentioned yesterday." He paused, lowering his voice. "Heard Martinez giving you grief in the briefing. That man wouldn't know tactical brilliance if it bit him on his perfectly pressed ass. Ghost allowed herself a rare smile. Chen, your faith in me is touching, but maybe save the editorials for after we're back on the ground. Roger that, ma'am, just bring her home in one piece, both of you. The other pilots were already strapping in when Ghost climbed into her cockpit. The familiar ritual of startup checks provided a meditative focus: master arm switch, engine start, radio check. Each action performed with the unconscious competence that separated veterans from pretenders. Through her canopy, she watched Martinez gesturing emphatically at his wingman, probably sharing some bit of wisdom that would prove useless in actual combat. Kandahar Tower, Falcon Flight, request taxi clearance for immediate departure. Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with unnecessary authority. Falcon Flight, cleared to taxi runway 09. Wind 080 at 15 knots, altimeter 29er rate 7. The formation began its stately procession toward the active runway, 4 engines singing in harmonious anticipation. Ghost's position at the rear gave her a perfect view of her wingmen, their flying styles already evident in how they handled ground operations. Hendricks flew with textbook precision, every movement calculated and deliberate. Peterson showed flashes of natural talent tempered by insufficient experience. Martinez flew like a man, trying to prove something to an audience that had stopped watching years ago. Tower Falcon lead, ready for departure, Martinez announced as they reached the runway threshold. Falcon lead, cleared for takeoff. Contact departure control on 254.7. Ghost watched the first 3 aircraft accelerate down the runway, their afterburners painting the morning sky with pillars of flame. When her turn came, she advanced the throttle with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. The F-16 responded instantly, pressing her back into the ejection seat as they climbed toward the mountains where 18 American soldiers waited for salvation. The transition from ground to air always felt like resurrection to Ghost, leaving behind the petty politics and institutional sexism for a realm where physics trumped prejudice. At 12,000 feet, she took her assigned position in the formation's trailing edge, watching the Hindu Kush mountains rise from the desert floor like ancient teeth. Falcon Flight, this is Overlord. The AWACS controller's voice filled their headsets with mechanical precision. Be advised, we're tracking multiple fast movers inbound from the northeast. Bearing 045, Angels 20, approximately 40 miles and closing. Martinez's response came with predictable bravado. Copy, Overlord. Falcon Flight is ready to engage. Ghost bit back her first instinct, to point out that engaging enemy aircraft wasn't their primary mission. The soldiers on the ground needed extraction, not an aerial circus to satisfy Martinez's ego. She'd seen too many rescue operations fail because pilots prioritized glory over objectives. Ghost, you copy that traffic. Peterson's voice carried the slight tension of a pilot facing his first real combat. Solid copy 3, Ghost replied, her tone deliberately calm. Maintain formation discipline. Our mission is those soldiers, not hunting MiGs. Through her canopy, the mountains below revealed their secrets to trained eyes. Ghost identified the extraction point, a narrow valley with limited approach options and even fewer escape routes. The terrain would funnel any attacking aircraft into predictable patterns, creating opportunities for someone who understood the geometry of 3-dimensional warfare. Falcon Flight, Overlord. Updated intelligence indicates SA-24 sites have gone active. Recommend immediate course correction to avoid SAM envelope. Martinez's reply carried the frustration of a man accustomed to having his tactical decisions go unchallenged. Negative, Overlord. We maintain current heading. Falcon Flight can handle a few outdated surface-to-air missiles. Ghost felt the familiar chill that preceded disaster. She'd watched overconfident pilots make similar decisions, usually from hospital beds or memorial services afterward. The SA-24 wasn't some Cold War relic. It was a sophisticated system capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously. Martinez's dismissal revealed dangerous ignorance masked as professional confidence. The radio crackled with urgent transmission from the ground. Any station, this is Viper 6. We are taking heavy fire and request immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow. The voice belonged to someone fighting for his life, each word measured against the possibility it might be his last. Viper 6, this is Falcon lead, Martinez responded with theatrical authority. We're inbound your position, ETA 12 minutes. Hold tight, cavalry's coming. Ghost checked her navigation display, calculating approach vectors that would minimize exposure to both enemy aircraft and surface-to-air threats. The valley's geography offered opportunities for someone willing to think beyond conventional tactics: steep walls that could mask radar signatures, thermal currents that might confuse heat-seeking missiles. She'd flown similar terrain in the Balkans, learning lessons that weren't taught in any manual. Falcon 2, maintain close formation, Martinez ordered. We're going in hot and fast. No fancy maneuvering, just overwhelming firepower. Hendricks acknowledged with professional resignation, clearly recognizing the tactical flaws in Martinez's plan, but lacking the rank to voice objections. Ghost sympathized. She'd spent years watching superior officers make decisions that endangered their subordinates' lives while claiming credit for any resulting success. The mountains ahead revealed their true scale as the formation approached, vertical walls of stone and ice that dwarfed the aircraft flying between them. Ghost felt the familiar sensation of entering hostile territory, a hyper-awareness that came from knowing that every decision might be her last. The radio filled with increasingly desperate calls from Viper 6, their situation deteriorating with each transmission. Contact, Peterson's voice cut through the radio chatter with sharp urgency. Multiple bandits, 12 o'clock high, descending fast. Ghost looked up through her canopy and saw them. 6 aircraft diving from the sun's glare with the predatory grace of raptors. Their silhouettes resolved into Soviet-era designs, probably MiG-29s flown by pilots who'd learned their trade in conflicts the American media preferred to ignore. The enemy formation split into 2 elements, clearly executing a coordinated attack that would trap the Falcons between converging threats. Falcon flight break formation, Martinez shouted, his earlier confidence evaporating into panic. Engage at will, engage at will. The sky erupted into chaos as 8 aircraft began a deadly ballet among the mountains. Ghost watched Hendricks and Peterson scatter according to their training, seeking altitude and maneuvering room that would allow their technological advantages to dominate. But Martinez's aircraft remained level, flying straight into the teeth of the enemy formation like a moth drawn to flame. The first missile launch appeared as a white contrail streaking across the morning sky, followed immediately by 3 more. Ghost recognized the telltale signature of AA-11 Archers, short-range heat-seekers that could turn her F-16 into scrap metal in less than 30 seconds. She broke hard left, pulling enough G-forces to gray the edges of her vision while dispensing chaff and flares to confuse the incoming weapon. Falcon lead is hit. Hendricks' voice carried the hollow shock of watching his leader's aircraft disintegrate. Martinez is down, repeat, Falcon lead is down. Ghost rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar lock while processing the tactical situation. With Martinez gone, command fell to the senior remaining pilot, her. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who'd questioned her competence had just been killed by his own overconfidence. Falcon flight, this is Ghost, she transmitted with calm authority. I have the lead. Peterson, maintain defensive posture. Hendricks, you're with me. We're completing the mission. The response came immediately. Ghost, this is Peterson. Negative on mission continuation. We need to abort and call for backup. -3, Ghost replied while executing a knife-edge turn between 2 mountain peaks. 18 soldiers are counting on us. We don't abandon our people. She could hear doubt in Peterson's breathing over the radio, a young pilot facing the moment when abstract training transformed into life-or-death reality. Ghost understood his fear, had felt it herself during her first combat mission over Bosnia. But fear could be managed, channeled into the hyper-awareness that kept pilots alive when mathematics and physics conspired to kill them. Falcon 2, status report, Ghost ordered while tracking the remaining enemy aircraft on her radar display. "Two's defensive, but I've got a MiG-29 on my 6 and he's not giving up," Hendricks replied through gritted teeth. "Could use some help here, Ghost." "On my way too. Peterson, take high cover and watch for SAM launches." Ghost pulled her F-16 into a climbing turn that would have impressed her old instructor at Nellie's, a maneuver that combined technical precision with an intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved in three-dimensional space. The enemy pilot pursuing Hendricks had positioned himself perfectly for a textbook intercept, but he'd forgotten the first rule of mountain warfare: geography matters more than geometry. She approached from below and behind, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The MiG pilot never saw her coming. One moment he was lining up for a kill shot. The next he was trying to evade an AIM-9 Sidewinder that tracked him with relentless precision. The explosion briefly painted the sky orange before gravity claimed the debris. "Good kill, Ghost," Hendricks called out with genuine admiration. "How the hell did you get behind him like that?" "Experience too. Reform on my left wing. We've got a mission to complete." The remaining enemy aircraft had withdrawn to a safe distance, apparently content to wait for the SA-24 sites to finish what they'd started. Ghost could see the logic. Why risk additional losses when ground-based defenses could eliminate the intruders without risking precious aircraft or pilots? It was sound tactics from their perspective, which made it her problem to solve. "Viper 6, this is Ghost," she transmitted on the ground frequency. "What's your current status?" The reply came amid the sound of automatic weapons fire. "Ghost, Viper 6. We're down to 14 effectives, low on ammunition, and taking fire from 3 directions. Enemy armor is moving into blocking positions. We need extraction now or we're not going home." Ghost studied her tactical display while processing the information. The enemy had clearly planned this operation carefully, luring American forces into a trap, then using coordinated air and ground assets to prevent rescue. It was the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested foreign advisors or extensive training, neither of which appeared in intelligence briefings. "Copy, Viper 6. Falcon flight is inbound your position. Be ready to mark your location with smoke on my command." She switched to the flight frequency. "Falcon flight, listen carefully. We're going in low and fast, using the valley walls to mask our approach. Peterson, you'll provide high cover while Hendricks and I make the attack run. Questions?" "Ghost, this is Peterson." The young pilot's voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "The SAM sites are still active. How do we avoid getting shot down?" "By being where they don't expect us to be, 3. Trust me." Trust, such a simple word that carried the weight of life and death in combat aviation. Ghost had earned that trust through 3 tours of combat flying, each mission adding to her reputation as a pilot who brought her wingmen home alive. But reputation meant nothing to missiles that traveled at 3 times the speed of sound, guided by computers that didn't care about past performance. The valley narrowed as they approached the extraction point, its walls rising like cathedral buttresses toward the morning sky. Ghost led the formation into a descent that challenged the envelope of their aircraft, pushing the F-16's limits while maintaining enough energy to escape if the situation deteriorated. Below, she could see muzzle flashes and smoke that marked Viper 6's defensive position. All stations, be advised we have multiple SAM launches." The AWACS controller's voice carried the clinical detachment of someone watching death approach from a safe distance. Ghost saw the first missile rising from a concealed position on the eastern ridge, a white spear of destruction climbing toward her aircraft with mathematical precision. She waited until the last possible moment before initiating a maneuver her grandmother had taught her in childhood stories about Russian aviators who fought impossible odds with cunning rather than courage. The forgotten roll began as a simple barrel roll, but transformed into something else entirely. A complex three-dimensional maneuver that combined aspects of defensive flying with offensive positioning. It required perfect timing and an intuitive understanding of how missiles tracked their targets, knowledge that came from years of studying weapon systems that wanted to kill her. As her F-16 rotated around its longitudinal axis, Ghost felt the missile pass harmlessly beneath her aircraft, its proximity fuse confused by the unexpected flight path. She completed the maneuver and immediately pulled into a dive that carried her below the valley's rim, where ancient stone walls provided protection from radar-guided weapons. "Holy shit, Ghost," Peterson's voice carried awe and disbelief. "How did you just do that?" Family Secret 3, stay focused, we're not done yet. But the radio had fallen silent except for the static of empty frequencies. Across 3 combat air wings and countless training squadrons, pilots were trying to process what they'd just witnessed. The forgotten roll wasn't just a defensive maneuver. It was a piece of aviation artistry that transformed physics into poetry, danger into dance. Ghost pressed her attack while the enemy struggled to reacquire targeting solutions, diving toward the valley floor where Viper 6 fought for survival. Her targeting computer painted symbols across the heads-up display, marking enemy positions with the digital precision of modern warfare. But hitting targets required more than technology. It demanded the kind of aggressive flying that turned aircraft into weapons. "Viper 6, pop smoke now," Ghost ordered while lining up her first attack run. Purple smoke billowed from the Americans' position, clearly marking their location among the jumbled rocks and sparse vegetation. Ghost could see enemy forces maneuvering for final assault, dismounted infantry supported by armored vehicles that had moved into position during the night. It was a textbook example of combined arms tactics executed with professional competence. Her first pass scattered the attacking infantry with a precise delivery of cluster munitions that transformed the eastern approach into a kill zone. Secondary explosions suggested ammunition cook-offs or fuel fires. The kind of collateral destruction that indicated her targeting had been accurate. She pulled up and rolled inverted, watching Hendricks begin his attack run with the smooth confidence of a pilot who'd found his rhythm. "Good hits, good hits," Viper 6 called out with the enthusiasm of men who'd just been given additional time to live. "Enemy forces are withdrawing to the north. We can see your birds. You're beautiful." Ghost smiled despite the danger surrounding them. Ground troops always referred to close air support aircraft as birds, a term of endearment that acknowledged the symbiotic relationship between infantry and aviation. She'd been called worse things by better people, but being beautiful to soldiers fighting for their lives felt like the highest compliment possible. "Falcon flight, this is Overlord," the AWACS controller interrupted with updates that changed everything. "Be advised, enemy reinforcements inbound from multiple directions. Estimate company strength infantry with armor support, ETA your location 15 minutes. Ghost checked her fuel gauge and weapon status while calculating the tactical mathematics of aerial warfare. They had enough ordnance for one more effective pass, maybe 2 if they conserved ammunition. After that, they'd be reduced to providing moral support while watching American soldiers die, because politicians had decided that rescue operations were too risky for public relations. "Peterson Hendricks, give me a weapons check," Ghost ordered while climbing back to attack altitude. 3 has 2 Maverick missiles and 400 rounds of 20 Mike, Peterson reported with growing confidence. 2 has 1 Maverick and approximately 300 rounds, Hendricks added. still showing full defensive systems. Ghost nodded, satisfied that they retained enough firepower to influence the battle's outcome. But influence wasn't victory. It was merely the opportunity to create conditions where victory became possible. The difference between those concepts had determined the fate of every military operation since warfare began. Viper 6, this is Ghost, she transmitted while watching enemy vehicles appear on distant ridgelines. We can give you one more pass, then you need to move to the extraction point. Time is not our friend. Copy Ghost, we're preparing to move now. Thanks for keeping the wolves away from our door. The wolves, an apt metaphor for an enemy that hunted in packs and showed no mercy to the wounded or slow. Ghost had fought similar opponents in 3 different conflicts, learning that respect for enemy competence was the first step toward defeating them. Underestimating opponents was how pilots ended up in prisoner-of-war camps or shallow graves. Her second attack run targeted the armored vehicles that posed the greatest threat to ground extraction. The Maverick missile locked onto the lead BTR-80 and guided itself to impact with the ruthless efficiency of American technology. The explosion sent a pillar of black smoke into the morning sky, marking another small victory in a war that measured success in survived encounters rather than strategic objectives. Ghost, this is Peterson. The young pilot's voice carried new authority born from surviving his first combat engagement. I'm tracking additional air contacts inbound from the west. Looks like the party's getting crowded. Ghost checked her radar display and confirmed Peterson's assessment. 4 more aircraft approaching at high speed, probably additional MiG-29s responding to distress calls from their ground forces. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, transforming from a rescue operation into a potential massacre that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Falcon flight, this is Ghost, she announced with calm determination. We're going to execute a fighting withdrawal. Peterson, you'll escort Viper 6 to the extraction point. Hendricks, you're with me. We're going to buy them some time. Ghost, negative, Peterson protested with surprising firmness. We should all escort the ground team. You can't take on 4 enemy fighters alone. 3, I'm not alone. I've got Hendricks and 40 years of family tradition. Execute your orders. The radio fell silent as Peterson processed her command, probably recognizing the finality in her voice that indicated non-negotiable decisions. Ghost understood his reluctance. Abandoning wingmen violated every principle of fighter aviation, every lesson learned since aerial warfare began. But sometimes principles had to yield to reality, and reality demanded that 18 soldiers reach safety regardless of the cost. 2, you ready for this? Ghost asked while turning toward the approaching enemy formation. Lead the way, Ghost, Hendricks replied with quiet confidence. I've got your 6. They climbed toward the sun, gaining altitude and energy that would provide tactical options when the engagement began. Below them, Viper 6 began their movement toward extraction under Peterson's protective cover, leaving thin trails of dust that marked their progress across the valley floor. Ghost watched them through her canopy, knowing that their survival depended on the next few minutes of aerial combat. The enemy formation approached with textbook precision, 2 pairs of aircraft separated by altitude and bearing, clearly intending to force the Americans into a defensive engagement that would favor superior numbers over individual skill. It was sound tactics executed by competent pilots, which made them dangerous opponents worthy of respect and careful planning. Hendricks, take the high pair, Ghost ordered while selecting her weapon systems. I've got the guys coming in low. Remember, hit and run, don't get drawn into a turning fight. Copy, Ghost, thanks for trusting me with this. Trust again, that essential element of military aviation that transformed individual pilots into effective teams. Ghost had learned to trust carefully and completely, knowing that half measures in combat usually resulted in empty seats at the officers' club. Hendricks had earned her trust through competent flying and steady nerves under pressure. The engagement began with missile launches that painted white contrails across the morning sky, each weapon guided by computers that calculated intercept courses with mathematical precision. Ghost watched two AH-11 Archers streak toward her aircraft while executing a defensive maneuver that combined her grandmother's stories with 40 hours of simulator training at Nellis Air Force Base. The first missile passed harmlessly to her left, confused by chaff and electronic countermeasures that transformed her F-16 into a Ghost that radars couldn't quite hold. The second weapon tracked more accurately, forcing her into a high-G turn that pressed her deep into the ejection seat while darkness crept around the edges of her vision. She held the turn until physics threatened consciousness, then released into a dive that carried her back toward the valley floor. "Ghost, good defensive," Hendricks called out while engaged in his own aerial duel. "I'm tracking one bandit destroyed, one running for home." Ghost looked up and saw the confirmation, scattered debris falling toward the mountains, while a second aircraft retreated toward the northeast, trailing smoke from damaged engines. Hendricks had proven himself in combat, earning his place among the pilots who could be trusted when survival hung in the balance. But two enemy aircraft remained committed to the engagement, diving toward Ghost's position with the aggressive maneuvering of pilots who decided that trading lives was an acceptable outcome. She recognized their tactics from intelligence briefings, foreign mercenaries or advisors with extensive training and combat experience, not the inexperienced conscripts that populated most enemy air forces. "Falcon flight, this is Overlord," the AWACS controller reported with clinical precision. "Viper 6 has reached the extraction point. Pickup birds are inbound, ETA 6 minutes. 6 minutes, an eternity in air-to-air combat, where engagements were measured in seconds and pilot decisions created immediate consequences." Ghost calculated fuel consumption and ammunition expenditure, while evading another missile that streaked past her canopy close enough to read warning labels printed on its casing. "Peterson, what's your status?" Ghost asked while executing another defensive maneuver that her instructors would have called impossible. "Ghost, we're holding the perimeter," Peterson replied with the steady voice of a pilot who'd found his courage. "Ground team is ready for pickup. How are you doing up there?" Ghost rolled inverted and pulled toward the valley floor, using terrain masking to break radar lock while considering her response. How was she doing? She was flying the fight of her life against superior numbers while trying to save 18 soldiers she'd never met, commanded by officers who'd questioned her competence until she'd proven them wrong with actions rather than arguments. I'm doing what I was trained to do," Ghost replied while lining up a shot at the nearest enemy aircraft. "Keep those soldiers safe." Her AIM-9 Sidewinder launched with a satisfying growl, tracking its target with the relentless determination of American engineering. The MiG-29 never had a chance. One moment it was maneuvering for position, the next it was falling toward the mountains in pieces that would provide scrap metal for local farmers. But the final enemy pilot had used her missile engagement to close distance, positioning himself for a guns-only attack that would require precise deflection shooting and nerves steadier than his opponents. Ghost could see his aircraft in her mirrors, a MiG-29 flown by someone who understood the geometry of aerial combat and wasn't intimidated by American technology or training. "Ghost, you've got a bandit on your 6, Hendricks called out with sharp urgency. "He's locked up, preparing to fire." Ghost felt the familiar chill that preceded death in aerial combat, that moment when physics and mathematics converged to create outcomes that couldn't be changed by skill or determination. The enemy pilot had achieved perfect position, and her F-16 lacked the energy to escape through conventional maneuvering. In 3 seconds, she would be dead, unless she attempted something that violated every principle of safe flying. Time slowed to the crystalline clarity that accompanied life-threatening situations, each second stretching into detailed moments that contained entire lifetimes of experience and memory. Ghost thought of her grandmother's stories about Russian pilots who'd fought impossible odds over Stalingrad, using cunning and desperate courage when conventional tactics offered only death. The forgotten roll began as a standard barrel roll, but transformed into something unprecedented, a complex maneuver that combined aspects of aerobatics with defensive flying, creating a flight path that confused targeting computers and human pilots alike. Ghost's F-16 rotated around all three axes simultaneously, tracing a pattern through three-dimensional space that seemed to defy physics and common sense. The enemy pilot's cannon fire streaked harmlessly through the space her aircraft should have occupied, 20mm shells, creating a deadly geometry that intersected with empty air instead of aluminum and flesh. Ghost completed the maneuver and immediately pulled into a climbing turn that positioned her behind her opponent, transforming Hunted into Hunter in less than 10 seconds. Jesus Christ, Ghost, Peterson's voice carried awe and disbelief. What the hell was that maneuver? Family tradition, 3, Ghost replied while tracking the fleeing MiG with her remaining sidewinder. My grandmother called it dancing with angels. The missile launch ended the engagement with mathematical finality, converting a dangerous opponent into falling debris that posed no further threat to American forces. Ghost watched the explosion bloom against the mountain backdrop, knowing that she'd witnessed the end of a skilled pilot who'd simply encountered someone more skilled on the wrong day. Falcon flight, this is Overlord, the AWACS controller reported with evident relief. All bandits destroyed or departed. Pickup birds are on final approach to extraction site. Ghost climbed toward the rendezvous point where Peterson maintained protective orbit over the rescue helicopters, her F-16 responding to control inputs with the eager responsiveness of a machine that had been pushed to its limits and found them adequate. Below, she could see the distinctive silhouettes of MH-60 Black Hawks settling into defensive positions, while Viper 6 prepared for extraction. Ghost, this is Viper 6 Actual. A new voice appeared on the radio, probably the ground commander who'd been too busy fighting to make social calls. I don't know what you did up there, but you saved 18 American lives today. We won't forget. Copy, Viper 6, Ghost replied while watching soldiers board the rescue aircraft. That's what we're here for. But gratitude felt strange to someone accustomed to skepticism and subtle dismissal from colleagues who questioned her competence based on assumptions rather than evidence. Ghost had spent 3 tours proving herself repeatedly, each mission adding to her reputation, while changing nothing about institutional attitudes that treated female pilots as experiments rather than assets. Falcon flight, this is Kandahar Tower. The radio crackled with instructions for their return journey. You're cleared direct to home plate. Contact approach control on 254.7. Whiskey tanks are standing by for immediate refueling. The flight home passed in contemplative silence as each pilot processed what they'd experienced and witnessed. Ghost led the formation through mountain passes that looked different in afternoon light, their shadows creating patterns that suggested ancient meanings beyond human understanding. She thought about her grandmother's stories, wondering if the old woman had experienced similar moments when tradition and training combined to create something greater than their individual components. Ghost, this is Hendricks. Her wingman's voice carried the thoughtful tone of someone reassessing previously held beliefs. I need to ask you something about that maneuver you pulled back there. Was that something they teach at the weapons school? Negative, 2, Ghost replied while adjusting her heading toward Kandahar. That was something my grandmother taught me when I was 8 years old, using a paper airplane and stories about the Great Patriotic War. Your grandmother was a pilot. She was a navigator on night bombers over Germany. The men called her the ghost of Stalingrad because enemy fighters couldn't predict her flight paths. She said survival required thinking differently than your opponents expected. Hendricks absorbed this information while the formation descended toward familiar terrain, each mile carrying them further from danger and closer to the mundane reality of post-mission debriefings. Ghost knew the questions that awaited: tactical assessments, ammunition expenditure reports, recommendations for medals that might or might not be approved by officers who hadn't been there. Kandahar approach, Falcon flight, requesting straighten approach to runway 09. Ghost transmitted as the airfield appeared on the horizon. Falcon flight cleared straighten approach, runway 09. Wind 085 at 12 knots, altimeter 2991. Good work today, people. The tower controller's informal praise carried more weight than official commendations, representing recognition from professionals who understood the difference between routine missions and combat that tested pilot skills against life-threatening opposition. Ghost felt a momentary warmth that had nothing to do with cockpit temperature or desert sun. The landing approach proceeded with textbook precision, 4 aircraft touching down in sequence with the smooth coordination that marked professional airmanship. Ground crews materialized with the efficiency of pit teams, conducting post-flight inspections that would determine aircraft status for subsequent missions. Ghost shut down her engines and began the methodical process of securing systems that had performed flawlessly under extreme conditions. Major Kozlov, report to the squadron commander immediately upon debriefing completion. The crew chief informed her while conducting his own inspection of battle damage that wasn't immediately visible. Ghost nodded acknowledgement while completing her post-flight checklist, knowing that summons to the squadron commander could indicate either recognition or investigation. In her experience, successful missions often generated more questions than failures, particularly when they involved unconventional tactics that challenged established doctrine. The debriefing room filled with pilots, intelligence officers, and commanders whose questions revealed varying degrees of understanding about air-to-air combat. Ghost answered each inquiry with professional precision, describing tactical decisions without revealing the intuitive processes that had guided her actions. Some knowledge couldn't be transmitted through briefings. It had to be earned through experience and preserved through stories that connected generations of aviators. Major Kozlov, regarding the defensive maneuver you executed during the final engagement. Colonel Harrison's voice carried the careful neutrality of an officer trying to understand something outside his experience. Can you describe the technical parameters for inclusion in our tactical database? Ghost considered her response while studying faces around the conference table, some genuinely curious, others skeptical that anything valuable could come from unconventional sources. She thought about her grandmother's advice. Share knowledge with those who will use it to save lives, little wolf. Guard it from those who would use it to harm others. Sir, the maneuver combines elements of barrel roll and split-S techniques, executed simultaneously rather than sequentially. It requires specific energy and altitude parameters that make it unsuitable for routine training. I'd recommend limiting instruction to experienced pilots facing life-threatening situations. The intelligence officer leaned forward with the intense focus of someone who specialized in extracting actionable information from combat reports. Major, have you observed similar techniques in enemy aircraft operations? Negative, sir. This maneuver originated from family traditions that predate modern fighter aviation by several decades. My grandmother flew night bombing missions over the Eastern Front, where survival depended on unpredictable flight patterns that confused enemy interceptors. The room fell silent as officers processed this information, their expressions revealing the cognitive dissonance that occurred when institutional knowledge encountered unconventional wisdom. Ghost recognized the moment. She'd seen it before when explaining tactics that didn't appear in any manual but had proven effective in actual combat. Major, are you suggesting that World War II aviation techniques have relevance to modern air superiority operations? The wing commander's question carried skeptical undertones that suggested predetermined conclusions. Sir, I'm suggesting that fundamental principles of aerial combat transcend technological advancement. Physics remains constant regardless of aircraft generation, and human factors haven't changed significantly since aviation began. My grandmother understood something about three-dimensional maneuvering that modern pilots sometimes forget. Ghost watched Colonel Harrison make notes that would probably disappear into classified files, never to influence training programs or tactical doctrine. She'd learned to accept such outcomes. Institutional military culture rarely embraced innovation that couldn't be traced to approved sources or validated through established channels. Major Kozlov, you'll remain available for additional debriefing sessions as required, Harrison concluded with the bureaucratic finality that marked completed paperwork. Dismissed. The debriefing room emptied with the efficient exodus that followed mandatory meetings, leaving Ghost alone with her thoughts and the lingering smell of burnt coffee. Through the windows, she could see ground crews preparing aircraft for evening sorties, their methodical professionalism providing continuity that transcended individual missions or personal recognition. Peterson appeared in the doorway with the hesitant manner of someone seeking guidance from unexpected sources. "Major, do you have a minute? I wanted to thank you for today and maybe ask about that maneuver you demonstrated." Ghost gestured toward an empty chair, recognizing the earnest curiosity that marked pilots genuinely interested in improving their skills rather than collecting anecdotes for squadron parties. "What specifically do you want to know, Lieutenant?" "Everything, ma'am. How you learned it, how you knew when to use it, whether it's something I could master with practice." Peterson paused, choosing his words carefully. "I've been flying for 3 years, and today was the first time I felt completely outclassed by an enemy pilot. That MiG driver who was chasing you, he was good. Really good." Ghost nodded appreciation for Peterson's honest self-assessment, a quality that distinguished pilots with potential from those destined for mediocrity. The pilot's skill level in that final engagement exceeded anything I've encountered in 3 combat tours. Someone trained those aviators very well, probably with extensive investment in tactics and equipment. "But you defeated him, using techniques from World War II. "I defeated him using principles that my grandmother learned over Stalingrad, adapted for modern aircraft and weapons systems. The specific maneuver was improvised based on energy state and geometric relationships that she taught me to recognize through stories and demonstrations." Peterson absorbed this information while staring through the window at aircraft that represented the culmination of 70 years of technological advancement. "Ma'am, would you be willing to teach me those principles? Unofficially, I mean. I understand that unconventional training might not be appropriate for formal instruction." Ghost studied the young pilot's face, recognizing the hunger for knowledge that had driven her own development from uncertain rookie to combat veteran. "Peterson, learning my grandmother's techniques requires more than simulator time and repeated practice. It demands understanding the psychological foundation that makes unconventional tactics possible." "I'm willing to learn whatever you're willing to teach, ma'am." The conversation was interrupted by Sergeant Chen's appearance in the doorway, his expression carrying the subtle urgency that preceded important announcements. "Major, you're wanted in the wing commander's office immediately. Something about a priority message from Pentagon." Ghost felt the familiar chill that accompanied unexpected summons from senior leadership, particularly when they involved communications from Washington. In her experience, Pentagon messages rarely contained good news for field-grade officers who'd demonstrated initiative during combat operations. "Chen, any indication what this concerns?" "Negative, ma'am, but I saw 3 bird colonels heading toward the command post about 20 minutes ago. Whatever it is, it's big enough to get their attention." Ghost stood and adjusted her flight suit, mentally preparing for whatever bureaucratic complication awaited in the wing commander's office. She'd learned that military success often created more problems than failure, particularly when it involved methods that couldn't be easily explained or replicated through standard training programs. "Peterson, we'll continue our conversation later," she said while heading toward the door. "In the meantime, think about what you're really asking. Learning unconventional techniques means accepting responsibility for their consequences." The walk to the command post provided time for mental preparation, though Ghost suspected that nothing could adequately prepare her for whatever message had originated from the Pentagon's senior leadership. The building's interior reflected the austere functionality that characterized military architecture. Long corridors lined with motivational posters and safety reminders that nobody read after their first week of assignment. The wing commander's office occupied a corner suite that provided panoramic views of the flight line and surrounding mountains, its windows revealing aircraft and personnel moving with the purposeful efficiency that marked operational military bases. Colonel Davidson sat behind a desk covered with classified documents, his expression suggesting news that would complicate everyone's immediate future. "Major Kozlov, sit down," Davidson began without preliminary pleasantries. "I've received a priority message from Air Combat Command regarding your performance during today's mission. Specifically, your execution of an unidentified defensive maneuver that resulted in successful engagement against superior enemy forces." Ghost remained silent while Davidson read from classified message traffic that had probably generated significant interest among tactical analysts and weapons system evaluators. She recognized the institutional fascination with anything that provided advantage over peer competitors, particularly when it involved techniques that hadn't appeared in enemy intelligence assessments. "Major, you're being temporarily assigned to the weapons school at Nellis Air Force Base for comprehensive evaluation and documentation of your grandmother's aviation techniques. The assignment begins immediately. You'll depart Kandahar tomorrow morning aboard a priority airlift mission." The news struck Ghost with unexpected force, removing her from combat operations just as she'd proven her competence beyond any reasonable doubt. "Sir, with respect, I'd prefer to remain with my squadron. We're in the middle of a combat deployment and my wingmen are depending on continuity of leadership." "Major, this isn't a request," Davidson replied with the finality that ended military discussions. "The Pentagon considers your techniques to be potentially game-changing innovations that could provide tactical advantages across multiple aircraft platforms. Your temporary assignment includes full evaluation, documentation, and development of training protocols for operational implementation." Ghost absorbed this information while considering its implications for her career and her grandmother's legacy. The military's institutional approach to innovation often transformed personal knowledge into bureaucratic procedures, losing essential elements that couldn't be captured through technical manuals or simulator programming. "Sir, I need to understand the scope of this evaluation. My grandmother's techniques weren't developed for mass production. They're based on individual characteristics and intuitive responses that can't be standardized across pilot populations." "Major, those concerns will be addressed by the evaluation team at Nellis. Your responsibility is to provide complete cooperation and ensure that nothing is lost during the documentation process." Davidson handed her sealed orders that would govern her next assignment, their classification markings indicating high-level interest that extended beyond normal tactical development programs. Ghost recognized the institutional momentum that occurred when Pentagon attention focused on specific innovations. Resistance became impossible regardless of personal preferences or practical concerns. "Sir, what about my current squadron responsibilities? Lieutenant Peterson is still developing his skills, and Hendricks could benefit from additional experience with unconventional tactics." "Your replacement will arrive within 48 hours," Davidson replied, while initiating the paperwork that would transfer her to different command authority. Major Collins has extensive combat experience and will provide adequate leadership continuity during your absence. Ghost nodded acknowledgement while processing the emotional complexity of leaving her squadron during active deployment. She'd spent 6 months building relationships and establishing tactical procedures that maximized each pilot's individual strengths, creating a team that functioned with efficiency rare in military aviation. The meeting concluded with administrative details that would facilitate her transfer, transportation arrangements, equipment requirements, and security protocols that governed movement of classified personnel between combat zones and training facilities. Ghost listened with professional attention while mentally preparing for separation from the mission that had defined her identity for 3 combat tours. Major, one final item, Davidson added as she prepared to leave. The evaluation at Nellie's includes psychological assessment and family history documentation. The Pentagon wants complete understanding of factors that contributed to your tactical development, including your grandmother's experiences during World War II. Ghost felt protective instincts sharpen at this information, recognizing institutional tendency to dissect personal relationships in pursuit of operational advantages. Her grandmother's stories contained elements that transcended military utility, family bonds, cultural heritage, and survival wisdom that couldn't be reduced to tactical procedures. Sir, I'll provide appropriate cooperation within the bounds of personal privacy and operational security. Major, you'll provide complete cooperation as directed by your orders. Dismissed. The walk back to her quarters provided opportunity for reflection on sudden changes that would remove her from familiar surroundings and trusted colleagues. Ghost had learned to accept military life's inherent unpredictability, but this assignment felt different, more invasive and potentially destructive of relationships that had required years to develop. Her quarters reflected the Spartan functionality that characterized temporary lodging in combat zones: basic furniture, minimal personal items, and communications equipment that connected her to family members thousands of miles away. Ghost began the methodical process of packing personal effects while considering how to explain her sudden departure to squadron members who'd begun to trust her leadership. A knock on her door interrupted the packing process, revealing Peterson and Hendricks with expressions that suggested unofficial knowledge of her reassignment. Military bases thrived on informal communication networks that often provided more accurate information than official channels, particularly regarding personnel movements that affected popular officers. Major, we heard you're being transferred to Nellie's. Peterson began with the careful neutrality that suggested rehearsed conversation. Is there anything we can do to help with preparation or transition? Ghost appreciated their concern while recognizing the underlying question about leadership continuity during her absence. Both pilots had shown significant improvement under her guidance, developing confidence and tactical awareness that would serve them throughout their careers. Gentlemen, I'm temporarily assigned to the weapons school for evaluation of tactical techniques demonstrated during today's mission. Major Collins will assume squadron leadership during my absence. He's an experienced combat pilot who will provide excellent guidance. Hendricks stepped forward with the earnest expression that preceded important questions. Major, what about the training you promised Peterson? Those unconventional techniques that your grandmother developed, will that knowledge be lost if you're transferred? The question touched on Ghost's deepest concerns about institutional appropriation of family traditions that had been preserved through personal relationships rather than formal documentation. She'd watched military bureaucracy transform individual innovations into standardized procedures that lost essential elements during translation. Hendricks, the techniques my grandmother taught me can't be learned through classroom instruction or simulator training. They require understanding of principles that must be internalized through experience and reflection, not memorized through repetition. "But you could teach us those principles before you leave," Peterson asked with hopeful urgency. Ghost considered the request while weighing competing obligations, military orders that demanded immediate compliance versus personal responsibility to preserve knowledge that might benefit future aviators. Her grandmother's voice echoed from childhood memories. "Share wisdom with those who will honor it, little wolf. Knowledge dies when it remains hidden." "Meet me at the squadron briefing room at 2100 hours," Ghost decided with sudden clarity. "Bring your personal notebooks and prepare for information that won't appear in any official training manual." Both pilots departed with expressions of anticipation and gratitude, leaving Ghost alone with decisions that would influence her grandmother's legacy and her own military career. She resumed packing while mentally organizing knowledge that had been transmitted through stories and demonstrations rather than formal instruction. The evening briefing room provided appropriate setting for unconventional education. Empty chairs arranged around a projection screen that wouldn't display classified tactical procedures, only principles that transcended specific aircraft or weapons systems. Ghost arrived early to arrange materials that would support explanations of concepts that challenged conventional understanding. Peterson and Hendricks entered precisely at 2100 hours with notebooks and expressions that suggested serious commitment to learning, whatever she offered to teach. Ghost recognized their hunger for knowledge that extended beyond standard curriculum, the intellectual curiosity that distinguished exceptional pilots from competent ones. "Gentlemen, what I'm about to share comes from family traditions that predate modern military aviation by several decades," Ghost began while dimming lights that would focus attention on essential concepts. "My grandmother learned these principles during combat operations where conventional tactics offered only death." She moved to the whiteboard and began sketching diagrams that illustrated three-dimensional relationships between aircraft, threats, and terrain features. Each drawing represented tactical situations that her grandmother had described through stories that combined technical instruction with emotional context. "The fundamental principle underlying all unconventional maneuvers is misdirection, creating false expectations in your opponent's mind that lead to tactical mistakes. My grandmother called it dancing with shadows, making your aircraft appear where enemies expect while positioning it where they don't." Peterson raised his hand with the hesitant manner of someone seeking clarification about concepts that challenged established training. "Major, how do you create false expectations in an enemy pilot's mind during high-speed combat?" "By understanding psychological factors that influence tactical decision-making," Ghost replied while adding details to her diagrams. "Enemy pilots make assumptions based on their training and experience. If you can identify those assumptions, you can exploit them through unexpected responses." The explanation continued for 90 minutes, covering principles that connected aerodynamics with psychology, individual skill, with tactical innovation. Ghost found herself channeling her grandmother's teaching methods, combining technical information with emotional context that made abstract concepts personally meaningful. "The forgotten role works because it violates enemy expectations about how aircraft behave under specific conditions," Ghost explained while demonstrating hand movements that illustrated complex three-dimensional maneuvers. "Most pilots assume that defensive actions follow predictable patterns, but my grandmother taught me to create patterns that exist outside normal tactical envelope." Hendricks scribbled notes with focused intensity, clearly recognizing knowledge that might prove valuable during future combat encounters. "Major, could these principles be applied to other defensive situations beyond air-to-air combat?" "Absolutely. The underlying concepts apply to any tactical situation where misdirection provides advantage over conventional responses. My grandmother used similar techniques during night bombing missions, creating false approach patterns that confused enemy searchlights and anti-aircraft fire. The briefing concluded with practical exercises that tested understanding of principles rather than memorization of specific procedures. Ghost watched both pilots work through tactical problems, recognizing intellectual development that occurred when abstract concepts connected with personal experience. Gentlemen, remember that these techniques require constant practice and adaptation, Ghost warned while collecting training materials. What worked for my grandmother over Stalingrad might not work exactly the same way in modern combat, but the underlying principles remain valid. Peterson closed his notebook with the satisfied expression of someone who'd acquired valuable knowledge. Major, thank you for sharing this information. Will you continue developing these techniques at Nellie's? Ghost considered her response while recognizing institutional tendencies that might transform family traditions into bureaucratic procedures. I'll provide appropriate cooperation with evaluation requirements, but some knowledge can't be preserved through official documentation. The most important elements must be transmitted personally, from instructor to student. The departure from Kandahar occurred during pre-dawn darkness that concealed emotional farewells between squadron members, who developed professional relationships based on mutual respect rather than formal hierarchy. Ghost carried minimal personal equipment aboard the transport aircraft, leaving behind most physical reminders of her combat deployment. The flight to Nellie's Air Force Base provided time for reflection on changes that would define the next phase of her military career. Through the aircraft's small windows, she watched terrain transition from desert mountains to American suburbs, each mile carrying her further from combat operations toward institutional evaluation that might validate or destroy her grandmother's legacy. Nellie's appeared on the horizon as a sprawling complex of runways and buildings that supported the most advanced fighter training in American military aviation. Ghost recognized the base's reputation for tactical innovation and pilot development, though she wondered whether institutional culture could accommodate knowledge that originated outside established channels. The reception committee included officers whose rank and demeanor suggested high-level interest in her arrival and immediate assignment to evaluation protocols. Ghost noted their expressions, professional curiosity mixed with skepticism about claims that couldn't be verified through standard testing procedures. Major Kozlov, welcome to Nellie's. Colonel Martinez greeted her with formal courtesy that masked underlying questions about her reported capabilities. We're looking forward to comprehensive evaluation of the techniques you demonstrated during recent combat operations. Ghost recognized the institutional tone that preceded intensive scrutiny, knowing that her next few weeks would determine whether family traditions gained recognition or disappeared into classified files. Her grandmother's voice provided guidance from childhood memories. Trust your instincts, little wolf. Truth survives even when institutions try to bury it. The evaluation began immediately with medical examinations that tested physical capabilities, psychological assessments that probed mental characteristics, and technical interviews that documented tactical knowledge. Ghost submitted to each procedure while maintaining protective distance from information that transcended military utility. Major, describe the specific physiological sensations you experience while executing unconventional maneuvers, the flight surgeon requested, while reviewing test results that measured stress responses and spatial orientation abilities. Doctor, the sensations are similar to normal aerobatic flight, with additional awareness of three-dimensional relationships that might not be immediately apparent through instrument displays. Ghost replied while concealing knowledge that couldn't be reduced to medical terminology. The psychological evaluation proved more challenging, conducted by specialists who sought to identify personality traits that enabled tactical innovation under extreme stress. Ghost recognized their methodology while protecting emotional connections that provided foundation for her unconventional capabilities. Major, tell me about your relationship with your grandmother and how her experiences influenced your tactical development. The psychologist requested with clinical detachment that reduced family bonds to research data. My grandmother shared stories about survival during wartime, emphasizing principles that applied beyond specific historical contexts. Ghost replied while editing memories that contained elements too personal for institutional consumption. The technical evaluation involved simulator sessions designed to replicate combat conditions while measuring performance parameters that might explain her tactical success. Ghost demonstrated requested maneuvers while recognizing that mechanical reproduction couldn't capture essential elements that made them effective. Major, we're having difficulty replicating the defensive maneuver you executed during your last combat mission, the test pilot reported with frustrated confusion. The simulator data suggests that your aircraft exceeded design limitations without structural failure. The maneuver requires specific energy management and timing that can't be programmed into simulation software. Ghost explained, while watching technicians adjust parameters that couldn't accommodate human factors beyond mechanical measurement. Days accumulated into weeks of intensive evaluation that documented measurable aspects of her capabilities, while missing essential elements that couldn't be quantified through institutional methodology. Ghost provided appropriate cooperation while protecting knowledge that required personal transmission rather than bureaucratic processing. The final evaluation session brought together senior officers whose interest in her techniques extended beyond tactical applications to strategic implications for American air superiority. Ghost recognized the institutional momentum that occurred when Pentagon attention focused on potential advantages over peer competitors. Major Kozlov, our evaluation indicates that your tactical techniques provide significant advantages in specific combat situations. General Patterson announced with the authority that accompanied flag rank and strategic responsibility. However, we've encountered difficulty translating your capabilities into training protocols that can be implemented across pilot populations. Ghost nodded acknowledgement while recognizing confirmation of her concerns about institutional appropriation of family traditions. Sir, I attempted to explain that my grandmother's techniques require individual adaptation rather than standardized application. Major, the Air Force requires training methods that can be systematically implemented and measured for effectiveness. Your techniques appear to depend on factors that can't be reliably reproduced through conventional instruction. The statement contained implicit criticism of knowledge that couldn't be processed through established channels, reflecting institutional bias toward innovations that supported bureaucratic procedures rather than individual development. Ghost had expected this outcome while hoping for different results. Sir, perhaps some tactical knowledge is better preserved through personal transmission rather than systematic documentation, Ghost suggested, while recognizing futility of challenging institutional assumptions. Major, the military can't base tactical doctrine on techniques that depend on family traditions or personal characteristics that can't be replicated. Your methods may be effective for you, but they lack the standardization required for operational implementation. General Patterson's conclusion marked the end of evaluation that had consumed 6 weeks of intensive testing and analysis. Ghost received orders for return to operational assignment, her techniques categorized as interesting but impractical for broader application. The flight back to operational deployment provided opportunity for reflection on institutional limitations that prevented recognition of knowledge that didn't conform to established procedures. Ghost understood the military's requirement for standardization, while recognizing that some innovations transcended bureaucratic processing. Her return to squadron operations occurred during a period of reduced combat activity that allowed gradual reintegration with pilots who'd continued developing their skills under different leadership. Ghost noted changes in their confidence and tactical awareness, recognizing professional growth that occurred through experience rather than formal instruction. "Major, welcome back." Peterson greeted her with enthusiasm that suggested genuine appreciation for her return. "We've missed your guidance, and there are tactical questions that Major Collins couldn't answer based on conventional training." Ghost appreciated his honesty while recognizing the diplomatic challenge of transitioning between leadership styles that emphasized different approaches to pilot development. She'd learned to navigate such situations through focus on mission effectiveness rather than personal recognition. "Peterson, tell me about the tactical questions that arose during my absence." "Ma'am, we encountered enemy aircraft using defensive maneuvers that seemed similar to techniques you demonstrated, but none of us could identify appropriate responses based on standard training. Major Collins recommended conventional tactics that proved ineffective during engagement." The information confirmed Ghost's suspicions about enemy adaptation to American tactical procedures, suggesting that unconventional techniques had become necessary for maintaining air superiority against opponents who'd studied standard approaches. Her grandmother's wisdom gained renewed relevance in evolving threat environment. "Peterson, show me the engagement reports, and I'll provide tactical analysis based on principles we discussed before my departure." The subsequent briefing revealed tactical sophistication among enemy pilots that exceeded previous assessments, indicating advanced training and equipment that challenged American advantages in technology and pilot preparation. Ghost recognized the strategic implications of facing opponents who'd learned to counter conventional tactics. "Major, how do we respond to enemies who have adapted to our standard procedures?" Hendricks asked with concern that reflected broader questions about American air superiority. "By remembering that tactical superiority depends on continuous innovation rather than technological advantage alone," Ghost replied while studying engagement data that confirmed her grandmother's fundamental insight about survival requiring adaptability. Her recommendation for enhanced training in unconventional tactics encountered predictable resistance from senior officers who preferred established procedures over innovations that couldn't be systematically implemented. Ghost recognized institutional inertia while continuing to provide guidance that kept her pilots alive during increasingly sophisticated enemy encounters. The war continued with daily missions that tested pilot skills against opponents who demonstrated growing competence and tactical awareness. Ghost led her squadron through engagements that required creativity and adaptation, proving that her grandmother's principles remained relevant in contemporary warfare. Months passed with gradual recognition among younger pilots that conventional training provided foundation, but not ceiling for tactical development. Ghost watched Peterson and Hendricks mature into confident aviators who could adapt standard procedures to unexpected situations, carrying forward knowledge that couldn't be preserved through official documentation. The final mission of her deployment occurred during winter weather that limited visibility and complicated navigation through mountain terrain. Ghost led a four-ship formation through conditions that tested every aspect of pilot training and aircraft capability, demonstrating leadership that combined technical competence with tactical innovation. Enemy contact occurred during the return flight, with sophisticated opponents who'd clearly studied American tactics and developed countermeasures designed to exploit conventional responses. Ghost found herself executing variations of her grandmother's techniques, adapting principles learned in childhood to 21st century combat conditions. The engagement concluded with tactical victory that preserved American lives while demonstrating continued effectiveness of unconventional approaches to aerial warfare. Ghost's after-action report emphasized the importance of tactical flexibility and individual adaptation, knowing that institutional memory would file her recommendations with other innovations that challenged established doctrine. Her departure from combat deployment marked the end of 3 tours that had proven her competence beyond any reasonable doubt, while failing to change institutional attitudes that questioned female pilots' capabilities. Ghost accepted this outcome with philosophical resignation, knowing that change occurred gradually through accumulated evidence rather than individual demonstration. The transition to stateside assignment provided opportunity for reflection on military career that had demanded constant proof of competence while offering limited recognition for tactical innovation. Ghost chose assignment to Pilot Training Command, recognizing opportunity to influence future aviators through personal instruction rather than bureaucratic procedures. Training new pilots required different skills than leading combat missions, emphasizing education and mentorship over tactical command. Ghost discovered satisfaction in watching young aviators develop confidence and capability, recognizing that knowledge transmission provided meaning beyond personal achievement. Her reputation among student pilots grew through demonstration of techniques that enhanced their safety and effectiveness, though she carefully avoided sharing knowledge that might violate institutional policies regarding unconventional training. The balance required diplomatic skill and careful judgment about what could be taught within established frameworks. Years passed with gradual accumulation of informal influence that extended beyond official recognition or documentation. Ghost's former students carried forward principles that couldn't be captured in technical manuals, creating networks of pilots who understood that survival sometimes required thinking differently than their training suggested. Peterson visited during his transition to instructor duty, bringing news about squadron developments and tactical innovations that had evolved from their earlier conversations. Ghost noted his growth from uncertain rookie to confident leader, recognizing successful transmission of knowledge that transcended formal education. "Major, I want you to know that the principles you taught me have saved my life at least 3 times during subsequent deployments," Peterson reported with sincere gratitude. "I've tried to pass them on to younger pilots, but it's difficult without your grandmother's stories to provide context." Ghost appreciated his honesty while recognizing the challenge of preserving knowledge that required personal connection rather than institutional processing. Peterson, perhaps some wisdom is meant to be transmitted individually rather than systematically. Focus on pilots who demonstrate genuine curiosity rather than trying to reach everyone. Their conversation continued through evening hours that provided time for reflection on career transitions and evolving responsibilities. Ghost recognized satisfaction in watching former students develop into leaders who could adapt standard procedures to unexpected challenges. The letter arrived during autumn, weather that painted the base in shades that reminded Ghost of childhood visits to her grandmother's home. The return address indicated correspondence from military history research that had identified her family's wartime service through recently declassified documents. "Major Kozlov, our research has identified significant historical information about your grandmother's service during World War II." The letter began with formal language that preceded important revelations. Recently declassified Soviet archives indicate that Lieutenant Ekaterina Kozlov received recognition for tactical innovations that influenced bomber operations throughout the Eastern Front. Ghost read the enclosed documentation with growing appreciation for her grandmother's contributions to aviation history that had remained hidden behind Cold War secrecy. The official records described tactical techniques that matched stories she'd heard during childhood, validating family traditions through institutional recognition that came 70 years too late. The historical documentation included recommendations from fellow aviators who'd credited her grandmother with developing defensive maneuvers that saved countless lives during night bombing operations. Ghost recognized descriptions of principles that she'd adapted for modern aircraft, creating direct connection between wartime innovation and contemporary tactical development. Her grandmother's final commendation mentioned teaching responsibilities that had transmitted tactical knowledge to subsequent generations of Soviet pilots, ensuring survival of techniques that challenged conventional approaches to aerial warfare. Ghost understood suddenly that her own instruction reflected continuation of educational tradition that extended beyond family relationships. The revelation provided new perspective on institutional resistance to her tactical innovations, recognizing that bureaucratic skepticism reflected broader patterns that had historically rejected knowledge that originated outside established channels. Her grandmother had faced similar challenges, while proving that survival sometimes required defying conventional wisdom. Ghost's retirement ceremony occurred during spring weather that suggested renewal and continuation, rather than endings. Fellow officers gathered to acknowledge career that had demonstrated competence and leadership, despite institutional barriers that questioned female pilots' capabilities. The formal recognition included commendations for tactical innovation and pilot development that had influenced air warfare beyond official documentation. Ghost accepted honors while thinking about her grandmother's untold contributions to aviation history that had required 70 years for acknowledgement. Her final flight as active-duty pilot provided opportunity for private reflection on career that had balanced institutional obligations with preservation of family traditions. Ghost executed maneuvers that honored her grandmother's memory while demonstrating principles that would survive through students who carried forward knowledge that transcended formal training. The aircraft responded to her commands with familiar precision, climbing toward sky that connected present moment with childhood dreams and family stories. Ghost felt her grandmother's presence in control inputs that combined technical skill with intuitive understanding of how aircraft behaved in three-dimensional space. The landing marked transition from military service to civilian life that would provide different opportunities for preserving knowledge that required personal transmission rather than institutional processing. Ghost shut down her aircraft for final time while planning next phase of life that would honor family traditions through continued education. Her writing began during retirement months that provided time for reflection on experiences that had shaped understanding of courage, competence, and institutional change. Ghost documented stories that connected family history with contemporary aviation, creating bridge between wartime survival and modern tactical development. The book project attracted attention from aviation historians, who recognized value of personal accounts that provided context for technical innovations. Ghost worked with researchers who understood that some knowledge required preservation through narrative rather than analytical documentation. Publication occurred during anniversary commemorations that highlighted contributions of female aviators throughout aviation history. Ghost's book joined growing literature that documented women's roles in military aviation, despite institutional barriers that had historically minimized their achievements. Speaking engagements provided opportunities to share knowledge with audiences who appreciated family traditions that had influenced tactical development. Ghost addressed pilot groups and aviation organizations, emphasizing principles that transcended specific aircraft or historical periods. Young pilots approached after presentations with questions that demonstrated genuine interest in learning techniques that enhanced their safety and effectiveness. Ghost recognized familiar hunger for knowledge that extended beyond standard curriculum, identifying individuals who might carry forward traditions that required personal transmission. The Aviation Museum Project began when historians recognized need for exhibit that documented unconventional tactical development throughout military aviation history. Ghost contributed artifacts and documentation that illustrated connections between family traditions and institutional innovation. Her grandmother's personal items occupied display cases that provided context for tactical techniques that had influenced multiple generations of aviators. Ghost watched visitors study exhibits with expressions that suggested growing appreciation for knowledge that survived through family relationships rather than official channels. The legacy continued through informal networks of pilots who understood that survival sometimes required thinking differently than their training suggested. Ghost received letters from aviators around the world who'd adapted her grandmother's principles to contemporary challenges, proving that knowledge transcended geographical and cultural boundaries. Her final public appearance occurred during ceremony that dedicated memorial to aviators whose contributions had remained unrecognized during their lifetimes. Ghost spoke about her grandmother's service, while thinking about countless individuals whose innovations had influenced aviation development without receiving appropriate acknowledgement. The sky above the ceremony stretched toward horizons that connected present recognition with historical achievement, reminding audience that aviation progress required individual courage and institutional support. Ghost felt her grandmother's presence in wind that carried her words toward future aviators who would face their own challenges requiring adaptation and innovation. Her death occurred during peaceful sleep that followed day spent writing letters to young pilots who'd requested guidance about developing unconventional techniques. Ghost's final correspondence emphasized principles that had guided her career: courage, competence, and commitment to preserving knowledge that enhanced aviation safety and effectiveness. The funeral service attracted aviators from multiple generations who'd benefited from her instruction and tactical innovations. Speakers described career that had demonstrated excellence despite institutional barriers, emphasizing contributions that had influenced air warfare beyond official recognition. Peterson delivered eulogy that captured her influence on pilots who'd carried forward principles that couldn't be documented through standard procedures. His words connected her grandmother's wartime service with contemporary tactical development, illustrating continuity that transcended individual careers. The military flyover included aircraft representing different generations of fighter aviation, their formation honoring aviator, whose techniques had enhanced pilot survival throughout decades of evolving conflict. Ghost's legacy lived in principles that continued influencing tactical development through personal transmission rather than institutional processing. Her grandmother's stories survived through books that documented family traditions, connecting wartime innovation with contemporary aviation. The publication ensured preservation of knowledge that might otherwise disappear with individuals who'd carried it through personal relationships rather than formal education. Aviation schools incorporated selected principles from her tactical innovations into curriculum that enhanced pilot safety without compromising institutional standards. The integration represented successful balance between innovation and procedure, proving that some knowledge could bridge individual creativity and systematic implementation. The Memorial Scholarship supported aviation education for individuals who demonstrated potential for tactical innovation and leadership development. Recipients studied principles that emphasized adaptation and creativity, carrying forward educational tradition that honored both technical competence and personal courage. Years after her death, pilots continued discovering relevance of techniques that had originated from family traditions spanning multiple generations of aviators. Her influence extended through networks of instructors who understood that preservation of tactical knowledge required personal commitment rather than bureaucratic processing. The sky remained constant above changing landscape of aviation technology and tactical development, providing reminder that fundamental principles of flight transcended specific aircraft or historical periods. Ghost's legacy lived in understanding that survival sometimes required defying conventional wisdom while maintaining respect for institutional knowledge and procedural safety. Her grandmother's voice echoed through stories that connected past innovation with future possibility, reminding aviators that courage and competence remained essential regardless of technological advancement. The forgotten role survived as symbol of tactical creativity that honored tradition while embracing adaptation to evolving challenges. The final chapter of influence occurred through young pilot who discovered her book during personal crisis that questioned ability to succeed in aviation career. The reader found inspiration in stories that demonstrated how individual determination could overcome institutional barriers while contributing to aviation development. That pilot would carry forward principles learned through reading rather than personal instruction, proving that knowledge could survive through written tradition when direct transmission became impossible. The continuation ensured that her grandmother's innovation would influence future generations of aviators who faced their own challenges, requiring courage and creativity. The circle completed itself through understanding that aviation excellence required both individual innovation and institutional support, personal courage, and collective wisdom. Her legacy lived in balance between honoring tradition and embracing change, demonstrating that true tactical development transcended any single career or historical period, while maintaining connection with fundamental principles that defined aviation excellence.